Good afternoon. Sorry for a little bit of delay on the technological side. I want to personally express our gratitude for all of you being here. 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon is not the easiest time, but we really appreciate your presence. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to the University of Montana and the University of Montana administration. We have a very dear friend and colleague in Vice Provost John DeBoer. John, stand up and be recognized. Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, we appreciate his support and the support of the academic affairs at the University of Montana. This is the 21st annual Central and Southwest Asia Conference at the University of Montana. I don't know how we have done it for 21 years, but we have. And we are here. Today you will hear three very interesting, not mine, but the two will definitely be interesting. Two very interesting and one boring presentation, let's put it that way, by my colleagues here. We will start first with my good friend and colleague, Professor Michael Mayer, of the History Department, and then we will move to Bob Seidenschwartz, who is also a visiting scholar at the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center, but also past president of the Montana World Affairs Council, which allows me to express my special thanks to Montana World Affairs Council for all its support. This entire conference is co-sponsored between the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Center and the Montana World Affairs Council. So after Mike, Bob, and then myself, and then we will open it to as many questions as possible. There is a microphone there, and this is a university, so feel free to ask any questions as long as it's concise and to the point. We would appreciate quick questions so other people can get a chance. So with no further ado, give a Montana welcome to Professor Michael Mayer and Bob Seidenschwartz.
Okay, we'll see if the technology works. First of all, I want to make a point of thanking Meredith Nardi, who managed to do this year after year, which is just amazing to me. My job, I think, is to provide a perspective from the American side, because I'm not going to add very much of substance to what Meredith has to say about the Middle East. The other thing is that my agent always makes it an absolute ironclad rule that I don't go on after Meredith. Nobody wants to follow Meredith on the stage. So I want to start, what I want to talk about today is the relationship between Joe Biden and Israel. And a subset of that would be the relationship between Joe Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Biden likes to talk about his long-time support for Israel and his deep feelings for Israel. He also likes to talk about his friendship with Benjamin Netanyahu. And neither of those assertions is entirely false, and yet neither is without substantial qualification. As a senator, Biden repeatedly cast himself as a friend of Israel, but one who would tell Israel and its supporters the hard truths that they needed to hear. In other words, he would tell them his positions were very different from theirs on many occasions. Biden's political career also has been defined primarily by his commitment to his own personal advancement and not to any issue, defining issue of principle. Biden's also had a very long and sometimes contentious relationship with Netanyahu. Although his occasional animus toward Israel is not restricted to the personal relationship with Netanyahu. Both Netanyahu and Biden are difficult individuals. Both can be arrogant. Biden you can't depend on what Biden says. The record is just full of people who went to testify, particularly before the Judiciary Committee when Biden chaired it, and he would go up to them beforehand and talk to them and tell them everything would be all right, not to worry about it, and then he'd slaughter them when they testified before the committee. Two individuals would be both Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill, who testified to exactly that same experience. Netanyahu is undoubtedly bright, arrogant, thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. He often is, but that can lead to some lapses in judgment as well. As I said, the relationship between the two goes back decades and is marked by friendship, at least of a political nature, and also by friction. The two became friendly in the 1980s when Biden was a senator and Netanyahu was assigned to the Israeli embassy, first as an officer and then as ambassador. It's, I think, a mistake to think that the two were personal friends in the sense that you may be friends with your next-door neighbor or a colleague. They were political friends. The families did socialize, but it wasn't a deep personal friendship. Biden's relationship with Israel is even longer standing and somewhat more conflicted. This is the Biden that we're talking about, Biden back in the 1980s. Biden first visited Israel back in 1973 and met with the then Prime Minister Golda Meir. At that time, tensions were high between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and Meir told Biden, "We Jews have a secret weapon. We have nowhere to go." And Biden's repeatedly told that story. The part of that story that he doesn't tell is that he had just come from Egypt. And he assured Meir that Egypt was not preparing for war. He said they recognized Israel's military superiority and weren't going to test it. I think that may be proof of Robert Gates's comment in his memoirs that Biden was wrong on every major issue of foreign policy for the last however many decades. 40 days after that, Egypt, Syria, Jordan launched a war against Israel. In June of 1982, just days after the start of the war in Lebanon, Israel's then Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, met with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Biden said that he would go further than Israel was going. He said he would forcefully fend off anyone who sought to invade his country, even if it meant killing women and children. Begin immediately dissociated himself from Biden's remarks. "No, sir, attention must be paid. According to our values, it is forbidden to hurt women and children, even in war. Sometimes there are casualties among civilian populations as well, but it is forbidden to aspire to this." Biden then threatened Begin with holding back aid to Israel over Israel's settlements in contested territory. Begin said, "Don't threaten us with cutting off your aid. It will not work. Nobody came to our aid when we were dying in the gas chambers and ovens. Nobody came to our aid when we were striving to create our country. We paid for it. We fought for it. We will stand by our principles. We will defend them. And when necessary, we will die for them again, with or without your aid." Biden got angry, raised his voice, banged the table with his fist, and Begin replied, "This desk is designed for writing, not for fists. Don't threaten us with slashing aid. Do you think that because the U.S. lends us money is entitled to impose on us what they think we must do? We are grateful for the assistance we've received, but we are not to be threatened. Take note, we do not want a single soldier of yours to die for us." That was obviously a contentious exchange. Biden's support for Israel came out in a speech he gave in the Senate in 1986, though. He said, "It's about time we stop apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made, none. If there weren't an Israel, the United States would have to invent an Israel to protect our interests in the region." Biden's support for Israel, though, came out most forcefully when he saw a political advantage. In 1992, Secretary of State James Baker, he was Secretary of State in the administration of George H.W. Bush, publicly criticized the then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Biden gave a speech to AIPAC, the America-Israel Political Action Committee, and he said, "The absurd notion that publicly vilifying Israel will somehow change its policy, who in the hell do we think we're dealing with?" In 1999, Netanyahu, and believe it or not, there is Netanyahu back in the 1980s, Netanyahu was voted out as prime minister. A lot of people thought that was the end of Netanyahu's career. Biden sent him a note, sort of expressing his sympathy. And Netanyahu was clearly moved by that. Things changed after the election of 2008 when Biden became Barack Obama's vice president. Biden's relationship with Israel became more complicated and more contentious. Obama was less inclined toward Israel than earlier American presidents. He wanted to improve relations with Iran, which he saw as a potential source of stability in the region. That, I think, was a miscalculation. But as a member of the Obama administration, Biden's own ambivalent relationship with Israel also became more strained. In 2009, Biden told AIPAC, "You're not going to like my saying this, but do not build more settlements." Biden met that year with Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador, and said, whatever their differences, the United States and Israel were still friends and that the United States would, quote, "still defend you." But he urged Netanyahu to accommodate Obama. Things took a downturn in March of 2010 when Biden visited Israel. He met with Netanyahu. At a press conference, he said, "Progress comes in the Middle East when everyone knows there is simply no space between the United States and Israel." And then news broke that the Israeli Interior Ministry planned to build 1,600 apartments in Ramat Shlomo, a Jewish area in northwest, not East Jerusalem, northwest Jerusalem, which the Israelis regarded as an integral part of their state. But the neighborhood was built on former Jordanian land. It had originally been assigned to Israel in the partition plan in 1940, 47, 48, but as a result of the 48 war, Israel had it. And the Obama administration regarded it as Palestinian. The announcement actually came from a mid-level bureaucrat. Netanyahu knew nothing about it. And the apartments were not scheduled to be built for years, but it infuriated Biden, who canceled a dinner with Netanyahu. And then the next day, he gave an address at Tel Aviv University and spoke of the, quote, "unbreakable bond between the two countries," which was, quote, "impervious to any shifts." He called also for the release of an IDF corporal named Gilad Shalit, who was held hostage by Hamas. But with respect to Ramat Shlomo, he said, "At the request of President Obama, I condemn it immediately and unequivocally." After the speech, he went to Ramallah to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, who refused to commit to making peace with Israel. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton excoriated Netanyahu on the phone for 45 minutes, rebuked him for humiliating the president, and demanded a total freeze on building. The Obama administration took a very hard line publicly, denounced Israeli policy, and when Netanyahu visited Washington in March of 2010, he was treated very shabbily. The exchange between Obama and Netanyahu was especially acrimonious. Obama and his administration saw Iran as an ascendant power, and they believed that Iran had legitimate grievances with the United States, and also thought that Iran could assist in resolving regional conflicts, unlike the feckless, disunited Arabs and the troublesome Israelis. The result of this approach was the so-called Iran nuclear deal in 2015, which Netanyahu opposed very publicly. In 2015, at an Israeli Independence Day party, Biden said, "Israel is absolutely essential for the security of Jews around the world. And that's why you've never farmed out your security. The most admirable thing about you is that you've never asked us to fight for you. But I promise you, if you were attacked and overwhelmed, we would fight for you, in my view." But the Obama administration was overtly hostile to Netanyahu. Obama sent campaign advisors to Israel to defeat Netanyahu in an election and failed. In 2016, Biden spoke to J Street, which is a dovish, some say anti-Israeli, I think, but dovish lobby, a Jewish lobby in Washington. Biden said, "I firmly believe the actions of Israel's government has taken over the past several years, the steady and systemic expansion of settlements, the legalization of outpost land seizures are moving Israel in the wrong direction. They're moving us toward a one-state reality, and reality is dangerous." In 2016, in the final days of the Obama presidency, Biden played a central role in delivering an anti-Israel vote in the UN Security Council on Resolution 2334, which cast Israel as illegally occupying land in 1967 that had been granted to Israel by the UN partition plan in 47, but occupied by Jordan at the end of the war in 1948. In the 2020 campaign, Biden was one of the few Democratic candidates who said he would not use American aid as a means of pressing Israel for concessions. And in the end, Biden won the election. And let me begin at this point by saying I think that while his policies at times have been wrong-headed and even foolish, it's driven by two things. I think one is ideology, Biden's ideology and that of his advisors, which is very similar to that of the Obama administration. And it's compounded by a naivety. They tend to see the world the way they think it should be rather than the way it is. And people like Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who just before October 7th said the Mideast was more quiet than it had been for 2 decades, and added that he spent far less time on that area than his immediate predecessors. I bet you he wishes he had that one back. Especially when one looks at personnel, the Biden administration looks a lot like the Obama administration. Robert Malley, who'd been a negotiator with the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, became a lead negotiator. He eventually had a security clearance revoked for mishandling classified documents and was put on unpaid leave. The FBI investigated. No one's heard anything about that since. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had been the Deputy National Security Advisor and Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. The Biden administration, from its earliest stages, was consistently hostile, at least to Netanyahu's new government. It wasn't at the level of the Obama administration, but there were deep divisions and friction. In his typically inarticulate way, Biden said, "I think it's a mistake to think that as some members of his cabinet, and this is one of the most extreme members of cabinets that I have seen." What I think he was trying to say was that the coalition included the right wing of Israel's politics. Biden refused to invite Netanyahu to Washington. Once Netanyahu announced plans to visit China, Biden reversed his position. But beyond that, Biden pursued a series of policies that were contrary to Israel's interests. 3 weeks into his administration, he announced that the United States had plans to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council, which had made Israel bashing its primary focus. It's interesting to think that the administration might have demanded some reforms in exchange for rejoining, but they did not. 3 months into his administration, he restored funding to the Palestinian Authority, which Trump had suspended. And he did so even though the Palestinian Authority maintained what they called a martyrs fund that paid $300 million a year to various terrorists or their next of kin who murdered Israelis. That made it illegal for the United States directly to provide aid to the Palestinian Authority, so they directed the money through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. During his first year in office, Biden attempted to reopen a diplomatic mission to the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, but the government of then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Now, this is a government that included the left of center and Arab parties, blocked it. In March of 2023, Biden publicly snubbed Netanyahu, who just won a general election, and said he would not invite him to Washington in the near term. The reason given was the controversial reform of the judicial system in Israel. In June of 2023, the administration ended scientific and technological cooperation with Israeli entities in the West Bank, Golan Heights, and Jerusalem. Biden also revived Obama's policy of engagement with Iran. Early in the administration, Biden bent over backwards to resurrect some version of the Iran nuclear deal. That deal gave, and the proposed revival of the deal gave billions of dollars in sanctions relief to Iran in exchange for very little in the way of concessions. Biden proved unable to get that comprehensive agreement, and then, as a result, but then proposed yet a more favorable agreement. As a result of all of this, Iran had much more money and used it to support tyranny at home and terrorism abroad. Iran also stepped up nuclear enrichment. In many ways, I think the Biden administration represents a return to a U.S. approach to the Middle East that was dominant before the Trump administration, which held that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was the key to peace in the region. And also, I think as a subset of that belief, that one could achieve that by exerting pressure on Israel. After Hamas's terrorist slaughter of October 7th, Biden immediately supported Israel and its right to defend itself, although there were elements within the administration that made other noises. Biden visited Israel, and in a very famous moment as he got off the plane, Netanyahu and Biden hugged, these two old friends, such as they were, coming together. But as the war dragged on, casualties mounted, and so too did Arab, Muslim, and left-wing opposition to Israeli policy within the United States, and particularly within the Democratic Party. Biden's position has been interesting, I think. He's repeatedly used casualty figures from the Gaza Ministry of Health, which is basically Hamas, and asserted, rather absurdly as many do, that over 2/3 of those casualties were women and children. Even if one takes the Gaza Ministry of Health figures at face value, and also uses United Nations figures for the numbers of Hamas fighters killed, it would mean that virtually no male civilians were killed in the process. Because if 2/3 were women and children, the estimates go about 70%, 2/3, 70%. And and enough Hamas fighters were killed to make up another 25 to 30%. That would mean there were no male civilian casualties. It seems highly improbable. But Biden repeatedly expresses frustration also with Israel's strategy and tactics. He approved Charles Schumer's call on March 17th for new elections, which is basically regime change. The Biden administration hasn't called for regime change for any other country in the Middle East, not Iran, not Syria, but they did in Israel. The U.S. did not veto a UN resolution calling for an unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, which would not obviously have provided for the return of hostages. Netanyahu responded by canceling a delegation's trip to Washington and then backed off on that when he realized, I think, he'd overplayed his hand there. Biden, at the State of the Union, on a hot mic, was caught telling Anthony Blinken and Pete Buttigieg, "I told him, Bibi, you and I are going to have a come-to-Jesus meeting." Biden then invited Benny Gantz to the White House. Benny Gantz is a member of the war government in Israel, but he's an opposition leader, or at least an opponent of Biden and his party. It's effectively interference in an election. It was an act designed to split Israeli public opinion. And then things came to a head again after Israel accidentally killed 7 workers for the World Central Kitchen. Biden abandoned a call even for the release of hostages as a condition for a ceasefire. Some of those hostages, by the way, are American. Biden said strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation were unacceptable. U.S. policy, he said, with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action and on steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. After investigating the incident, Israel took responsibility. 2 senior commanders were fired. They reprimanded officers at lower levels. And it makes a striking contrast. Think back to August of 2021, after the bombing of Kabul's airport, when the United States struck a Toyota Corolla sedan, killed 10 civilians, including 7 children. They tracked the vehicle for 8 hours with a, quote, reasonable certainty that it posed a threat to U.S. forces at the airport. And for days, the Pentagon insisted that the strike had been properly conducted. Then on September 18th, General Frank McKenzie, head of the U.S. Central Command, admitted the strike was a tragic mistake. No one was fired. Biden didn't seem to think there was any need to go beyond that apology. I think it's also interesting, as just a side note, Jose Andres, the celebrity chef who founded the World Central Kitchen, which, by the way, provided meals for Israelis after October 7th, has accused Israel of targeting his associates, but he's offered no evidence. He said, "You cannot win this war by starving an entire population." The accusation is patently absurd. If Israeli policy were, in fact, to starve the entire population, what in the world was the World Central Kitchen doing there in the first place? Biden has stated his opposition to going to Rafah to eliminate the last 4 battalions of Hamas. The media and the Biden administration have emphasized Palestinian suffering, and they accuse Israel of not taking sufficient caution with civilian casualties. The truth seems to be, and again, these figures are all debatable and all uncertain, but the truth is that the IDF has the lowest ratio of military to civilian deaths in any modern war. It ranks between 1.4 to 1 and 1.1 to 1. John Spencer, the military veteran who chairs the urban warfare studies at West Point, said, Israel's taken more steps to avoid harming civilians than any military in history, including measures that increased the IDF's casualty rate and including measures that the United States did not take. Then, on April 16th, Iran launched a massive attack on Israel, 300 projectiles, almost all of which were shot down. The United States played an important role in coordinating that air defense, and the results were impressive, but still, five projectiles hit Israel. At this point, Biden has pledged to help defend Israel, but refuses to back an Israeli retaliation and urges Israel not to retaliate on its own. He told Netanyahu, "Take the win." One can only imagine if Franklin Roosevelt had given that advice to Winston Churchill after the Battle of Britain concluded. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, Michael, thank you for the presentation. Also, I do not want to forget to thank Artie Kia, who puts his heart and soul into these events and into the Institute. And this would not be possible without people like Artie, Montana World Affairs Council, and many others who we don't see behind the scenes that make it possible for us to come together here. So Artie, thank you very much. Because of time, we'll get right to this, but yes. You know, in thinking about this, I'm speaking to my community, my friends, and my family here today. And we've all had discussions about what's happening right now in the Middle East, and they're difficult discussions. They tend to be very emotional. We tend to have our viewpoints, which we feel very strongly about. And often, it's not with a lot of information that is important to that discussion. So I'm thinking about how do I explain, as Mirdad has asked me to do, some of the economic impacts of what we see happening right now. And a couple of days ago, I'm in the backyard, just getting done doing some work, and a friend of ours with my wife comes around the corner, and she sits down and says, "I'm coming to the conference. Can you tell me a little bit more about this?" And she was specifically asking about Israel and the Jews. And I didn't say this, but I thought to myself, oy vey. You know, this is going to be a tough one. How do I explain in a few minutes or in a few weeks or a few months thousands of years of history and of people that have worked, loved, married, intermingled throughout this entire region that we call the Middle East? So I was trying to give some brief understanding, and it really kind of helped me maybe just reconfigure a little bit my presentation. So I want to give you a few little just statistics that you may find surprising, and I hope enlightening to put in perspective just a little bit. And then I will talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is oil in the Middle East. What's the impact on us economically? Why does it matter? Why is it important? So let me just give you a little bit of info. Some of you may know this. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, yes or no. It's not a quiz. But square miles, Israel, 8,630, basically the size of New Jersey. Iran, 636,400 square miles. Now, I threw Montana in there just for reference, 145,509. You can put a whole lot of Israels into Montana. Russia, 6.6 million square miles. China, 3.7. US, 3.7. So we're talking about an incredibly small area with some countries around it that, in some cases, not a whole lot larger, but generally speaking, yes. And in the case of Iran, quite a bit. Population, Israel, 9.8 million people, of which 2 million of that are Arabs. They are Israeli citizens, but they are of Arab background and descent. I'm not going to mention the other countries for the sake of brevity, but Iran, 89,172,000 people. Quite a bit of difference, isn't there? Over the years, I've listened to Mirdad, I've read, I've learned the Iranian people, a deep, ancient culture, highly educated, culturally, leaders in the Middle East for centuries. So I'm asking myself, then what's going on here? This is a country that has a rich and varied culture. Here's this tiny little nation of a few million people, relatively speaking, with a much smaller landmass. And there was a story I ran across. A delegation from Utah was visiting with Israeli delegates. Why that meeting took place is they wanted to learn what was Israel doing and what were they doing right and what could be learned from this. So I'm just going to read a couple of thoughts that came out of that meeting and conference. You may have heard the expression Israel, startup nation. It's a combination of big dreams, perseverance, and a well-educated population. Does that sound like something we're familiar with? How about our own country? Our immigrant story, the people that have come here from the beginning of time. Big dreams, perseverance. This country of just 9 million people punches way above its weight and has been crowned startup nation. One of the best performing tech ecosystems in the world. Something we have here in the United States as well. Whether you're in California, Texas, East Coast, in the Boston area, we have our tech centers. So it's a concept that I want you to kind of think about a little bit. Tech ecosystems, what does that mean? They just don't pop up out of nowhere. There's got to be a number of different events that lend itself to this type of situation and the richness that it brings. So Israel ranks first in the world in the number of startups per capita. Research and development expenditures as a percent of GDP. Number one, venture capital investments per capita and unicorn per capita. So this rich system is something that has been very purposeful within the country as a collaboration between government and private sector. Human capital, when asked by the Utah delegation, what is your most important resource? Human capital. All we have in this part of the Middle East is our brains. Israel is not a country with rich natural resources. In fact, it's a country with very few natural resources. In Israel, a land lacking in natural resources, we discussed the greatest resource of all, human capital, which is richer than any of the resources in the earth. It's human capital that makes Israel the startup nation. So as I look at these events, I've heard over and over in my lifetime the story that has repeated itself, what seems to be endlessly. We've heard the explanations, we've heard the insights, we've heard the historical context. But I'm looking for an answer that says, how is this going to change? What's going to be the differential? What's going to be the collaboration? We're starting to see that collaboration with other Arab countries. If some of you know, prior to October 7th, Saudi Arabia was, I believe, very close to signing an agreement with Israel. The Abraham Accords, I'm not going to go into that, but I would ask all of you who have interest to look up the Abraham Accords. And what does that mean? These were bold steps taken by countries in the region. And as I looked at this, as I looked at what the Saudis, where they are economically, and the fact that they are the world's largest oil reserves, or very close to. If I'm wrong about that, my apologies. But they're looking out into the future and they're realizing that model cannot sustain itself forever. They have to diversify their economy. And they have to understand and recognize their human capital is what they need to engineer and mine and extract. Israel reflects that by the very quotes that I've read and by the very fact that you can look at their economic progress. So I'm asking myself, what's going to be the key that turns the Middle East to a place possibly that changes this dynamic? And I look at Iran, and I've learned so much from my colleagues here and many others. Iran's a country that has that same dynamic. Are you going to tell me the Jews are more intelligent than the Iranians? Or vice versa? These are human beings. These are people that have given the chance and the opportunity to be able to see and blossom into the full effect of what their human capital may be and what their resources are. There's no telling what they could do. And I know this is one of the things that hurts Mirdad, coming from this country and loving it as his homeland and understanding deeply the intelligence and the grit and the perseverance of the Iranian people. This is something that has to be worked on as much as the other parts of the equation. So I look at this and I offer to you that as a thought, as a discussion that we should be having, as a part of our policies, as a part of our own education here in this country. I believe this 110%. The United States has an opportunity at this time, going forward with the changes that I see happening economically, with the innovations that are taking place, with what I see happening in parts of this nation that are not being reported, because we tend to hear so much of the negative news, we forget right under our noses what's happening right here in Montana. Look at Missoula, Bozeman, Kalispell. There's things that are taking place that unless you have a conversation and get exposure to, you would not know. We're one of the leading states in photonics and exports of certain types of agricultural goods, but we are developing our own tech hub, our own tech hubs. So the United States is in a position, even with all of our differences, all of the craziness that takes place, always has. Just look at our history. It's always been messy. I call it a dog's breakfast. You know, anytime you've ever put food down in front of a hungry dog in the morning, you're going to have to clean it up because it's all over the place. So I want to leave you with the thinking, and then I'm going to talk about very briefly, and then we'll finish this up with Mirdad, that the U.S. and countries like Israel are partners in Europe. One of the things that happened when Russia invaded Ukraine and what recently Iran did with Israel is it galvanized situations that had been withering. And it brought to full attention some of the things that needed to be done, because when you hear adversaries talk about their intent, pay attention. They're not just saying this for the sake of making up words. They mean what they're saying. I want to read a quote that I ran across recently. This pertains to Iran and its missiles that it sent over into Israel. When your enemies are making a big, big mistake, don't interrupt them. Napoleon dictum. The world's public, I would say, how they, since October 7th, there was a window of understanding and a great deal of empathy for Israel. That has changed. Iran, by its actions, have redirected this again. So what will come of it, how it will develop, yet to be seen. Sometimes these things can be very short-lived. So I just wanted to make a few comments on that. On the energy side, oil is the lifeblood of this planet in terms of its economic lubricant. About 30% of the oil produced globally comes out of the Middle East. Iran's a major oil producer. Interestingly, we've had sanctions on Iran, but it's producing more oil than ever. Where's it going to? It's going to our friends in China and some other countries. China gets about 90% of its imports China's imports from Iran represent about 90% of Iran's oil exports. So you've got some issues in terms of how, as you can send missiles that cost a couple of $2 billion in the case of what it took Israel to defend itself. I don't know what it cost Iran to send those missiles, but without oil money, I would venture to say Russia and Iran would not be in the position that they're in right now. We're going to need oil for decades to come. We're going to need oil. Excuse me, I just said that. We're going to need oil, we're going to need gas, we're going to need coal, we're going to need nuclear power, we're going to need renewables. This isn't going away. So how do you use this and maybe think about this from a geopolitical standpoint? These are just the bigger questions that are raised here today and we'll have to have continued conversations about. So when you have an event that happens as it just did, what was interesting is when you looked at the oil futures on Sunday, they didn't spike. Now, why would they not spike when you have somebody attacking with several hundred missiles a country as significant and as important to the United States as Israel? Because I believe the oil futures represented, this is an event that's going to be over pretty quickly. And it reflects what maybe the geopolitical cards, the tea leaves that they're reading. Maybe they were wrong, but if they had believed that this event was going to continue or escalate, you'd be looking at oil well over $100 a barrel right now. Now, what does that mean? It means right now when we had the Fed saying we're not going to be lowering interest rates, we're still seeing too much inflation in the economy, that's a concern to us as consumers, and it permeates every component of our lives, from food to clothing to housing to automobile transportation. There isn't anything that isn't affected by what happens when the price of different energy sources go up. So when you look at events in the Middle East and you go, well, what does it mean to us? It means during an election year when one guy doesn't want to see higher oil prices because of what that could mean, the other guy talking about what he's going to do when he gets into office, bottom line is the consumers are asking themselves, what does that mean to me? We tend to vote with our pocketbooks, don't we? So oil is a key and unavoidable issue that we have to deal with and will continue to have to deal with. We've got a presentation afterwards, and somebody much more knowledgeable and erudite than myself is going to be speaking in depth about what they see happening within our own energy sectors and what some of the implications are. So because of time, and I know we're going to have a lot of questions, I want to stop now. I want to thank all of you for coming out here today. Will be available briefly afterwards, but I want to turn this over to my colleague, Mirdad. So,
John, yes, thank you. Well, this is going to be a shorter presentation because of the time, and we know you have many questions. Before I make my presentation, I want to make sure that everyone here understands how much time and effort has gone into this conference, and none of it would have been possible without the dedication and the commitment of the co-director of the Center for Central and Southwest Asia, that's Dr. Adi Kia. Adi, please stand up and be recognized. But we have to make this presentation as quickly as possible. And let me put a context before we go there, a context that I always approach these situations from, and that is the global context. The global context is that we are entering a new Cold War. At times, it's not very cold either. That is, we have a bipolar world. On the one hand, you have the emergence of a new alliance between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and even some other countries that we haven't heard of in Central Asia, for example, some of the former Soviet republics, and a few others are sort of thinking of joining, but these are the big kahunas, as sometimes they're referred to, and that's versus United States and its allies. You see this constantly resurfacing. You see this in the case of Ukraine. It is surfacing clearly who stands where. China is clearly behind Russia. Iran is openly and publicly providing the Russian armed forces with highly weaponized drones. This is not a secret. And you will see it, and I don't want to make any predictions, the same conflict resurface if China decides to incorporate Taiwan. These are potential hotspots and conflict zones which can only be described in the context of this new Cold War or this bipolar world. And why I bring it here, because you have to answer the fundamental question, why did this conflict resurface between Israel and Hamas in the first place on October 7th? And would it have reappeared or resurfaced had it not been for encouragement from countries such as Russia and China? I think the Iranian government is very close to Russia. The two armed forces are very closely allied. And I think the time for the attack by Hamas coincide with the time that conveniently make a conflict in the Middle East divert the attention from Ukraine. These are not accidental, and Russia's sort of silence on all this is not accidental either. But let us look at what happened on October 7th. This conflict has been going on since the second half of the 19th century. But on October 7th, you have Hamas, a Palestinian Islamist group, which the United States has designated as a terrorist group, attacking Israel. 1,200 Israelis are killed, and many are kidnapped, raped. Some of them have been killed. At least there have been 35 U.S. citizens who were killed. But this is very interesting. Right away, the essential response was, this is just a continuation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It has been going on for decades. It started especially after the formation of the State of Israel in May of 1948. It's just a continuation of that. I think that's a totally wrong analysis. This analysis cannot be contextualized in the context of Israel and Palestinians. It should be contextualized in a very different issue. And that issue is that while all this is happening, there is something else that is happening, and it's very, very important for us to understand. This is the question, why is a non-Arab country, namely Iran, which does not actually share a common border with Israel and has no territorial disputes with Israel and has never had any historical animus toward Israel. In fact, Jews and Iranians go back 2,500 years without any chapter of violence or bloodshed. One, because they are not neighbors. Second, Iranians are not Arabs. So why should an Islamic regime in Tehran support a Palestinian Islamist group in Gaza? And why is it actually determined to use Hamas as its proxy to destroy the State of Israel? That's the question that needs to be answered. And of course, what we have to understand is what was happening right before this attack. There was actually a peace process which was unfolding between the State of Israel and the Arab world. It had actually started slowly in previous administrations, but it reached a new height under the previous Trump administration. And I want to say here, I'm not giving credit either to the Republicans or Democrats. I'm equally alienated from both of them. I consider myself an independent voter. I think the level of ignorance among Democrats and Republicans is shameful and embarrassing. So I'm not going to be labeled, I hope, as either a Democrat or Republican. But the fact of the matter is, there were negotiations. There were negotiations for peace. Mike mentioned something very interesting, that the Obama and the Biden administration basically believe that peace should be based on, between the Israelis and Arabs, on mutual recognition, land for peace, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, while Israel lives next to it in security and peace. That should be the primary agenda. Well, during the Trump administration, we actually have a reversal of this modality. The modality was, there were some negotiations with Palestinians, but when Palestinians hesitated, why don't we just go and create a peaceful settlement between the Arab governments, which are willing to recognize Israel, and then Palestinians can join in the process. That was the logic behind the Abraham Accords, and the two countries which were actually willing to sign the Abraham Accords. And by the way, why Abraham? Because Arabs and Jews are descendants of the prophet Abraham, at least that's what they believe and they claim. And therefore, Abraham Accords brings a new era of peace. The two first countries were Bahrain in the Persian Gulf and the United Arab Emirates. They signed a peace accord. That peace accord was followed by 3 new countries. Morocco joined, Sudan joined, and a number of other Arab countries actually showed interest in joining this peace accords. And it was actually on the verge of going to Saudi Arabia and bringing the Saudis on board, with Saudi Arabia signing a peace accord with the state of Israel. Then the Arab world and Israel would have a permanent peace. Now we had a change of administration here. We had a reversal of the policy and return to the old sort of remedy of having Palestinians and Israelis negotiating instead. But there were other things. We actually withdrew from Afghanistan in July of 2021. That was a huge signal to Russia, China, the people in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, that the United States is not going to remain militarily involved and engaged in the Middle East. The motto of the Biden administration was that the focus would be on China and the issue of Taiwan. We have wasted too much money, too much armaments in the Middle East over all these wars, a lot of them futile and wasteful, and we're just not going to invest. We will move out, and it started with Afghanistan. Which proved to be a chaotic withdrawal, resulted, of course, in Taliban coming to power. It's an Islamist Taliban movement. But the Biden administration did not stop there. It actually waged a significant campaign of criticism against the Saudi government. Why did it do this? Of course, because of the heinous crime committed by the Saudi secret police, killing an innocent and brilliant journalist by the name of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi Consul General office in Istanbul, Turkey, right? Both Democrats and Republicans actually expressed a sense of disgust and outrage, which is absolutely correct in my belief, and they promised to punish the Saudi monarchy. This promise was actually actualized to some degree because the Biden administration actually threatened to take Saudi Arabia to a world platform in which the Saudi violation of human rights, abuse of human rights against Saudi women will be actually discussed openly. The result of this was sudden reversal when Russia invaded Ukraine. Gas prices go up, oil prices go up. Suddenly you realize you might hate the Saudis, but you need them at the same time. Cheap oil from the Persian Gulf is always helpful. So the same person who had threatened the Saudis to, because of their abysmal human rights records, which is absolutely correct, rushed to Saudi Arabia and received a very cold welcome, and he was told that the Saudis have now other plans. The Saudis have plans to engage China. This is very interesting. It's a completely new development. And the Saudis have a plan to engage Russia, to actually counterbalance United States, because United States have proved to be an unreliable ally, which has embarrassed the Saudi monarchy in front of the world. The result of this was, in fact, exacerbated by the third policy, which is re-engagement, as Mike also mentioned, of Iran in a new nuclear deal. The Obama administration had signed a nuclear deal to control the development of nuclear warheads by Iran, and the Trump administration had discarded that agreement. Now the Biden administration would revive it. But in return for reviving the discussions with Iran, the Biden administration decided to reopen the negotiations by providing a major concession to the Islamic regime in Tehran. That concession was that you can sell your oil and gas in world markets. This is a huge concession. And as Bob mentioned correctly, this is a concession which allowed Iran to sell its oil. But who is going to buy Iranian oil? China. And where does that money go? Well, Iran suddenly, within a year or so, was flush with cash to the tune of about $90 billion. 90 billion dollars. Iranian government, and I make a distinction between Iranian government and the Iranian people, of course, here, but immediately as they went to sort of the market and they're flush with cash, they rebuilt their military infrastructure, but they also used the money from the sale of oil to China and other buyers to actually supply their proxies in the region. Proxy number one, Hamas. Very important here, right? And of course, in the process, we have to understand there is a semi-revolution in Iran, woman life freedom revolution, hundreds of thousands of Iranians are out. We basically remain quiet because we are still negotiating with the Iranian regime, or at least we use that as an excuse to not express any support for this very important pro-democracy movement, the woman life freedom inside and outside Iran. Whatever the case may be, we actually supplied the Iranians with $6 billion to get some of our hostages out, which went on top of allowing Iranian regime to sell its oil and gas in the world markets. But Iran, typically, the more United States gave concessions, the more Iran turned it back and actually went in direction of Moscow and Beijing. Mr. Putin arrived in Tehran, received a hero's welcome here with Mr. Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the President Raisi, by the way, both of them mass murderers, known by the State Department and, of course, by all international organizations. But whatever the case may be, what really happened was that Iran actually consolidated this ring of fire around Israel. What is this ring of fire? This is very important for us to understand. This ring of fire had to go into action in order to disrupt the peace process between the Arab world and Israel. This ring of fire started with Syria. Iran is trying to establish bases in Syria. So far, it has 13 bases, land bases in Syria. And without permission from Mr. Assad in Syria, they would not have been able to do it. But now they have 13 bases. They have significant military technology in Syria. They have helped Assad to consolidate his rule. Assad has been saved from being overthrown. In return for remaining in power, Assad has provided concessions to the Iranian side, which is land bases inside Syria. At the same time, being in Syria helps Iran feed, arm, train its biggest proxy. And I have a problem, by the way, with this word proxy. Proxy is almost as if this is an independent movement out there and just comes to Iran whenever it's needed. It's really an extension of Iranian military and security forces. This is Hezbollah in Lebanon, Party of God. Its headquarters in southern Lebanon, just north of the state of Israel. It is armed with the most sophisticated missiles. So in case of a conflict between Israel and Iran, Hezbollah can be unleashed against Israel from the north. So Hezbollah now was receiving a huge portion of this revenue that Iran had made in the oil markets. Hezbollah has a full-fledged army. It's very well trained, and it's all armed and trained by Iran's elite revolutionary guards. And of course, the Lebanese Hezbollah would not have existed without the backing of Iran. But that's not where Iran stopped. Iran went to the second proxy. The second proxy was Hamas and the Gaza Strip, 25-mile sandy sort of strip next to the Mediterranean Sea. Mr. Ismail Hania came to Iran. You want to see it, you can see it on YouTube. The Hamas leaders actually say, half jokingly almost, they were about to leave Iran. Duffel bags arrived in the airport as they were about to leave Tehran. They opened the duffel bags, and the duffel bags were full of cash. The first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. And they were counting, and it was $21 million in cash right there in the airport. And finally, the pilot said, that's the only 7 we can take. You have to return and take the rest later on another plane. This is the level. It's not a secret, but you know, this is so interesting. And why I say this is when Hamas attacked Israel, the State Department said very interesting in Washington. It said, we have evidence of Iran supporting Hamas, but we have no evidence that Iran has been fully funded and armed by, that Hamas has been fully funded and armed by the Iranian government. Come on, watch YouTube, State Department, you know. You can do that at least a little bit. Whatever the case may be, what is Hamas? Harakatul Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which is the Islamic resistance movement. As one of presenters, Hudson Poland, had mentioned, Hamas is actually an extension of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Muslim Brotherhood is a radical Islamist movement which came into existence in Egypt in late 1920s. And Hamas is basically the offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was created among the Palestinians. What is the purpose of Hamas? Is it to create an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza? Of course not. This is another interview to watch, is the interviewer asked one of the leaders of Hamas, you have built hundreds of miles of underground tunnels. Why don't you allow Palestinian civilians who are suffering so badly, so many children, so many women, so many men, so many buildings, all being destroyed, and so many innocent people being killed? Why don't you allow them to use the underground tunnels you have created? The answer tells you everything. He said, these underground tunnels are only for Hamas fighters. The only question that followed was, so what is Hamas for? Who are the Palestinian people? Who is responsible for the Palestinian people? You know, and I say this almost word by word. He said, the Palestinian people are the responsibility of the State of Israel and United Nations. We are not here to take care of the Palestinian people. That's why Hamas has not built a single hospital. That's why Hamas has not built a single clinic. That's why Hamas has not built a single school or charitable foundation. The major, in fact, hospitals that have been built by various Islamic countries, such as Indonesia, for example, which has built first-rate hospitals in Gaza, and other Islamic countries which have given in great generosity to help the Palestinian people. As far as Hamas is concerned, its leaders have become billionaires. Why? Because terrorism is a very, very lucrative business. And Mr. Hania, Ismail Hania, the last time we know of his bank account is about $4 billion. And his sons are actually working in Turkey on construction projects. And he himself, the leader of this revolutionary radical organization, lives in a 5-star hotel in the country of Qatar, which tells you something about what kind of business war can be at this point. Whatever the case may be, Gaza has been part of the Palestinian political system, first Palestinian Authority, moderately secular and nationalistic, and after 2006, 2007, run by Hamas. And the question is, why don't you do something for Palestinians in Gaza? Well, nothing has happened. Instead, in a more conflicted approach toward Israel, they have convinced the Iranian regime that they can be a proxy, and they have received $360 million worth of direct aid from the Islamic regime. So waging war from Gaza was another part of that ring of fire. You know, I've showed this cartoon to others and in different presentations. This is, you know, one cartoon can tell a million stories. Here is Hezbollah and Hamas, basically, acting as the puppets. But that's not where they stopped this time. They added a new proxy, and that proxy are the Shia Houthis in Yemen, basically. And they have armed people who do not have enough to eat, who have no educational infrastructure, who have no medical infrastructure, with advanced ballistic missiles. Houthis, a tribal Shia group, Zaydis they are, 4 Shia imams they believe in rather than the 12 the Iranian regime believes in. But whatever the case may be, Houthis are receiving magnificent amount of aid and training and military support from Iran. And they have also been used to intercept shipping in the Red Sea in order to disrupt international trade and commerce. This is what Houthis are doing. Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon. And what happened initially was it backfired because there was global solidarity with Israel after October 7th. But as everybody had predicted, once it became a war, a full-fledged war, and once casualties mounted, and you see the bodies of children, you see the bodies of women, you see the bodies of Palestinian civilians, of course, it was international, global outcry against the death and suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And of course, the result of this, which is quite astonishing to watch, basically, and very disturbing, is that there is increasing a sort of rift between the United States and the Israeli government, as Mike mentioned correctly. But there is also just a humanistic sort of reaction of people feeling outraged by these casualties in Gaza among the Palestinian people. So there was a pause at one point. We had some hostages released, Israeli hostages. 250 Palestinian prisoners were released by Israel. But still we have 130 hostages in those tunnels held by Hamas. And when Israel responded by maximum force, you had a situation that changed, turned the table around completely, and made the situation much more sympathetic toward the Palestinians, because schools were being destroyed, hospitals were being destroyed, and it doesn't matter how many times Israelis would say, but Hamas fighters are hiding in these buildings and so on and so forth. This is a small piece of territory. There are about 2 million human beings there. You hit any building, you hit anything, a street or a back alley, innocent people will die as a result. Whatever the case may be, this massive aerial bombardment turned the table on Israel, basically, and especially after ground troops moved into Gaza and more hand-to-hand fighting erupted, you have mounting casualties, not only on the part of the Palestinian population and Hamas itself, which lost hundreds of fighters, but also among Israeli troops. Whatever the case may be, images such as this, Gaza is a very poor, impoverished, with 60 to 70% unemployment rate, a kind of an economy in shambles, lack of education, lack of medical care, and so on and so forth. These images outraged a large part of the world, and it put Bibi Netanyahu under mounting pressure. And on top of that, Israeli troops are being lost. He cannot release the hostages who are being held by Hamas. And suddenly, what happened over 2 weeks ago? Israel attacked this annex next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus. This was something that not too many people actually paid much attention to. It's once again Israel basically targeting the leadership of Iran's elite Revolutionary Guards, right? And they said, well, it's one more attack by the Israelis. But as soon as I looked at the names, I realized these are top commanders of Revolutionary Guards. On a holiday, by the way, they had come to this annex, which is next to the Iranian embassy in Damascus. There were no staff people. It's very interesting. The ambassador himself was not there. His family was not there. Nobody was there. There were only these 6 or 7 now, it's debated. And Israel, and it's very interesting, the annex was next to the Iranian embassy, but adjacent to Canadian embassy, right? So the Iranians thought, if our military leadership are actually coming together next to the Canadian embassy, the Israelis would not dare attack this annex. Well, the Israelis struck, and they struck so accurately that there was no harm to the Iranian embassy or to the Canadian embassy. But that annex came down, and all commanders were killed in the process. The result of this, and this is a very, 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 very interesting move. This was a move calculated not to eliminate 6 or 7 Iranian commanders who were actually planning further attacks by Hamas and Hezbollah against Israel. It was something else. It was actually forcing Iran to come from behind the wall of its proxies and show its real face. It was actually an act of forcing Iran to respond directly. Do you dare now? Right? We hit you. Right? What are you going to do? And for the first time, if you watch the Iranian media for about the last 2 weeks, there has been mounting pressure from the very supporters of the regime in Iran. What are you going to do now? You're going to accept this humiliation? You have to go out and respond. Hezbollah cannot do it from Lebanon. Hamas cannot do it from Gaza. The Houthis cannot do it from Yemen. This time, it's war, and you should respond. And Ali Khamenei, who never wanted to show his own hands and never say, we are in war, but he has been in war, but he wanted to hide behind his proxies, finally relented and said, all right, we're going to hit Israel. But what did happen? What happened is several things happened. This whole business of attacking with massive hundreds of drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and so on and so forth. First of all, it showed how awful the Iranian military technology is. It took hours for some of them to arrive, right? And of course, Arab countries next to Israel, especially the Saudis and Jordanians, who despise Iranian government. Remember, the Iranian government has targeted oil refineries in Saudi Arabia, has tried to destabilize the Jordanian monarchy and so on. They all unified with Israel and United States, opened their airspace and said, come and get these missiles flying over our airspace. And they actually participated in it. Overnight, what happened? You have a new coalition in the Middle East. You know, the shifting sands of the Middle East, right? Everybody thinks Arabs and Israelis, they don't get along. Guess what? The closest allies of Israel today as we speak are Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Right? They opened their airspace, and what happened? United States first, and then Israel basically shut down 99% of all these missiles which are coming to Israel. 4 or 5 of them hit an Israeli base, and One of them, ironically, this is the irony of it, the only casualty is an Arab girl, right? This level of incompetence, this level of backwardness is still not only embarrassing for Iran, it just destroyed the credibility of the Iranian regime in the eyes of its neighbors. With all this huff and puff, that we are such a strong military force, you couldn't hit one single target in Israel. And the question in Iran, as I speak to you, I was just checking, the question to Iran is, you have neglected democracy, you have neglected freedom, you have neglected the labor force, you have neglected Iranian women, you have suppressed the Iranian women in the worst possible fashion. Their goons and thugs are now in the streets of Tehran and other cities, throwing women who are not properly veiled into the back of trucks. God knows what happens to them. I don't even want to think about it. You do all these nasty things, right, to your own people, and you put billions of dollars, instead of putting it in healthcare, in education, in improvement of the lot of the average Iranian, and you cannot even hit a single target. That's how incompetent you are, right? So in some ways, I have to tell you, this is a huge, huge blow to the legitimacy. So what did they do? Because you guys are going to see more of these scenes, I'm just forewarning you as we wrap up. They brought several hundred people in this neighborhood, several hundred people on that neighborhood, with Iranian and Palestinian flags, that the Iranian people are celebrating the fact that we attacked Israel. Really. It reminds me of the NPR, right? When Khomeini had died, they had sent their reporters, National Public Radio, and they were shouting, "Death to America, death to America." And there is this American reporter from National Public Radio who said, "Hello, how are you? Can I talk to you?" So, "Where are you from?" So, with a bit of, anxiety. "I'm from United States." "Oh, thank God you're here." Said, "You were just shouting death to America." Let me show you. He opened his wallet, $20. The bus came and picked me up. I'm going to have a dinner after the demonstration, and I'm going to get the most favorite fruit in Persian culture, a watermelon. $20, watermelon, being bused to a demonstration. I will shout death to myself. Right? These are made-up demonstrations, right? 88 million Iranians are sitting at home, and for the first time, I think Mike mentioned it on the radio show, you know what has appeared on the streets of Tehran and other cities? Flags of Israel. And slogans, "Hit them harder," will follow with more demonstrations. This is the mood on the streets. This is for those of you who are interested. Look at Israeli flags on the streets of Tehran. Look at. We stand with Israel. This is after what, 45 years of a regime which claims to represent Islam, but has acted as the enemy of Islam, has embarrassed Islam, has put Islam to shame. With everything they have done, Islam has never had a worse enemy than these kinds of regimes or these kinds of movements, whether it's the Iranian regime or the Hamas or Hezbollah or the rest of them. Whatever the case may be, now you have demonstrations joined between Iranians and Israelis abroad, right? Joining demonstrations. But let me finish with this. What are the options? My guess, my prediction, and I'm horrible. Every time I have predicted, I have failed, basically. So don't count on it. The first thing first, Israel will retaliate. I know that for a fact. Israel will not allow this to go unanswered. The question is not whether Israel is going to respond, but what kind of response it will be. The Israeli War Cabinet has met. The Israeli cabinet as a whole has met several times. And there is a huge discussion among Israelis because there is no consensus among Israeli leadership. This is big. And of course, it's very interesting because Mike mentioned Biden and Netanyahu. I agree with your assessment of those personalities, at least. They're both think that they are the smartest guys in the room. But it's very interesting. When they talked, the only thing that was leaked out of the conversation was Biden telling Netanyahu, if you take an offensive action against Iran, we're not going to join, right? It's very interesting. And that is a message to Iran that despite your bad behavior, we are not interested in having open warfare with you. It's between Israel and the Iranians. But what has happened since Iran attacked? Suddenly the table has been turned. European countries, France, very important in this case, because it's invested in the Middle East. It has a lot of influence in parts of the Middle East, such as Lebanon. The British, the Germans, the Italians, they have all thrown their support behind Israel. So Netanyahu is saying, woof, here we are. I was under pressure until 2 days ago, and now everybody has to express their solidarity with me, which is a wonderful way to take a bit of a break. But the discussions among Israelis will go. Now, the last sentence. There are two major opinions within the Israeli government. One, which comes from the left and is more sort of against major military operation, says Israel can basically claim that just shooting down 99% of these flying objects, the cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, is a major victory. Announce major victory and do not retaliate, right? That's one way of celebrating this. We don't have to, because if we attack Iran, the table will turn around again. Right now, the world has a bit ignored the Gaza, right? You're not under pressure anymore, so keep that going a little bit and keep the Europeans and United States behind you. That's a nice way of sort of neutralizing the situation. The other part, which also includes some actually prominent leftists, but also people on the right, say that, in fact, Israel has to respond with maximum force, because if it doesn't, then it would create a notion and an impression that Iran can get away with it. So there has to be a response immediately and with a hard-hit response. We shall see in coming days what the decision is. Thank you very much. So we have the microphone. If you are interested in any questions, please feel free to come to the microphone and ask your questions, and do not hesitate. Please.
Sorry, I cannot help. I say, why should I say something? Okay, thank you very much for such a very interesting thing. But as you know, we cannot escape our own prejudice. We all have bias and prejudices. This is a very complex, extremely complex situation, as you know. But my question is, I cannot help the comments. The question is, why didn't you choose also to have someone speaking from the Palestinian side, whatever exactly that means? That bothers me a little bit. Second, when you said, Mike, that, oh, well, you seems to me to minimize the casualty, 2/3, well, doesn't count the men. There is sources, UN, Europe, and mostly European, American too, and I have sources in Europe, so you cannot, with a léger de main, evacuate, oh, they are all casualties. And when you speak about the economy, you said Israel is de Gaulle used to say it's an elite state. Noblesse oblige. If you are an elite, you're obliged to take care of those who, by chance or history, have fallen down, like the Palestinian. You didn't mention that Gaza is a very small, it's like the valley south of here with 2.5 million people. It's like a ghetto, it's hell on earth. And so, I mean, why? And I agree that certainly Iran manipulate Hamas and Hezbollah, which, by the way, has not fired anything yet. So why Iran was able to because Israel has not been able to solve the Palestinian situation for the last 40 years. We are left with a mess which is unbearable. It's a colony of Israel. Gaza is a colony. You know that, Mike. Why did you say that? Okay, and etc. I could go on, but I'm not on the panel, but I would like to take what I say into account. Please.
There we go. A couple of things, Michel. First of all, Hezbollah has fired, not massively, not what people were worried about, but they have fired, and they even hit an Israeli airbase. Facts do matter. You think about what you said. It's Israel's problem. The Palestinians are Israel's problem to solve. The Palestinians have been kept in camps, not integrated into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan. There were many people displaced in 1948, 47, 48, on both sides. The difference is of the many Jews who fled North Africa and Middle Eastern countries and settled in Israel, they were incorporated into the society. The Arabs who fled or were expelled from Israel were kept in camps and as a sore spot to foster opposition or whatever to Israel. It's not Israel's problem alone to solve. And with respect to Gaza as a colony of Israel, Israel didn't want Gaza. Gaza was the Gaza Strip. At the end of the war in 1948, it was Egypt. It was part of Egypt. Egypt kept camps there. The Palestinians launched attacks against Israel. It was part of what triggered the war in 1956. In 1967, when the Israeli army had orders not to take Gaza, they didn't want it. When they took it, when they received fire from Gaza, they took it. At the end, they offered it back. Egypt didn't want it. This is not Israel's problem. It is a problem for all the countries in the region.
So a couple of things. Thank you, Michel, for your questions and comments. First and foremost, I don't think any conference has ever invited as many people on the side of the Palestinians, representing some of leading scholars and analysts in this conference. This last 20, 21 years, if you check the list of the invitees, we went with what we had in a very short notice because this is how we had to do. But aside from that, I have always believed, personally, I believe in a two-state solution. I believe that you have two people who deserve to have their own independence, and they deserve to live in peace and security. So you have a Jewish state called Israel, and we have a Palestinian state in where Palestinians constitute the majority of the population, West Bank and Gaza. There is always this ifs and buts. The only problem here in front of us is the fact, and I think a lot of Palestinian friends would tell you this very, very openly but privately, is that you cannot negotiate with Hamas. Hamas doesn't even negotiate with other Palestinian groups. And let me remind you, and this is, I have to say this is the issue today we have, which is quite, for me, it's a bit fascinating, but to some degree disturbing. That is the progressive left, as it calls itself. It actually finds itself very comfortable with the Islamist fascism. This is, and I use that word not lightly. For me, Hamas is a religio-fascist organization. So if you actually force women, Palestinian women, who are, by the way, highly educated and highly independent-minded, Palestinian people as a whole are highly educated population in the Arab world, in the Islamic world as a whole. When you establish your regime and you make veiling mandatory, right? What are you doing? You're saying women cannot make a choice of their own. When you actually take homosexuals and you throw them off the roof, please go and look at it. What are you talking about? regime of tolerance, inclusion, democratic rights. That's Hamas, by the way. The number of Palestinian intellectuals, scholars, writers, journalists who have been knifed, who have been jailed, who have been silenced, who have been forced to leave the Gaza Strip because of what they said. They spoke up, right? They criticized. And I have to tell you, when an organization's closest ally is the worst totalitarian and the worst fascistic regime in the region, and I'm referring to the Islamic regime in Iran, what do you expect? Somebody going and saying, please come and do it. Now, Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, at least what you can say is Mahmoud Abbas is willing to negotiate and willing to negotiate on the basis of a two-state solution and negotiate directly by recognizing the state of Israel. Hamas has refused to recognize the existence of a Jewish state called Israel. What was the slogan that we heard disturbingly on the streets of this country? From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. That river is River Jordan, that sea is Mediterranean Sea. That is a Hamas slogan which calls for the total destruction of the Jewish state. And when you receive your military technology from Iran, that's a signal that you want the destruction of Israel. You have no intention of negotiating. If they changed, if they came down the high horse, if they apologized for the past and said, we are now in a new level, let's negotiate, that would be a different situation. But we are still waiting. So and this is what, this conflating the Palestinian people with Hamas is actually an insult to the Palestinian people. I think a large number of Palestinians are disgusted with Hamas, and I can make a simple promise to you. As this conflict continues, as the suffering of Palestinian mounts, the popularity of Hamas will diminish significantly, because more and more Palestinians realize that the key to the future is a two-state solution, is a mutual recognition of the two peoples with ancient history, ancient cultures, and the fact that the future of any Palestinian state depends on some kind of collaboration and working together, not only with Israel, but also with Jordan. Jordan, Israel, and if there is a Palestinian state, their economies and their future are intertangled together. And that's what we should aim for, not to force one side to negotiate with people who are calling for its destruction.
We're going to have to, my apologies here, because we do have another speaker.
Yeah.
So we're going to have one more quick question, and
Jamil,
we'll try to
please.
make the response efficient.
The comments of the first speaker I felt were rather one-sided, very, very pro-Israel. There's a lot of nuances in this whole discussion, right? Michelle has raised a very significant point. There's not much talk or opinions from the other side. This is still very pro-Israel. You guys are keeping on forgetting about the fact that Netanyahu's life, career, if you will, has been to never see a two-state solution, right? This he has said himself publicly, is that my greatest achievement is that on my watch, we have never seen a Palestinian state. And his party, his right-wing party is actively always trying to prevent at every state, at every step, a two-state solution, right? I mean, even before October 7th, we've continued to see ongoing West Bank, the settlers are coming in and harassing Palestinian homes, forcing them out. The Israeli army, which is supposed to actually be on the side of law and order, supports these settlers and actually is aiding in all of these Palestinians being forcibly displaced. The river to the sea is not only just from the Hamas side, it is from the right-wing Israeli side. The river to the sea from their side means a total Israeli state. No Palestinians in there. They want these guys to voluntarily.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, truly sorry, because you bring up a lot of points that let these gentlemen address this. But for brevity of time, that's the only reason, my apologies for interrupting, but you bring up a number of points that a lot of us have concerns about.
Jamil, you are right.
No, please, please.
Yeah, wrap it up, though, please. Yeah.
Please.
Wrap it up, right? So these are, these are the other complexities that, it's great to see one side. Netanyahu also has had a very great stake in destabilizing that whole region. He has seen all of these enemies of the state of Israel. Iraq was another one that all of you guys missed, right? Saddam Hussein was the grand evil, and he came to the U.S. Congress with an impassioned speech saying that we have to remove Saddam. And we've seen all that happened, right? So even though Netanyahu says, I don't want to have U.S. troops involved.
I'm sorry, please, no, I asked you to please wrap it up, and it has not occurred, so I'm taking a little bit of latitude here. Please let you address these questions.
No, I think Jamil is correct in that Netanyahu has never supported a two-state solution. And I think there is the issue of the settlers in parts of the West Bank especially. But look, if you negotiate, and that's all I want to say because we have to wrap it up, Jennifer's session is coming up. If you negotiate, things can change. By the way, there were Israelis in Gaza too, right? There were negotiations. And negotiations took place not with the left wing or pro-peace faction in Israel. It was actually done with Sharon, who was basically on the right, just like Netanyahu. Guess what happened? Israel withdrew. Israel actually dismantled the settlements. If you negotiate, there is a chance. If you do not negotiate, and if you wage attacks such as the one in October 7, the chance that you empower people like Netanyahu increases. So if you are criticizing Netanyahu, open the door to open negotiations. And you're empowering the peace camp in Israel. You says, okay, the other side is coming with an olive branch. But if you're attacking, you're raping, you're killing, I'm not talking about you, of course. If the other side is doing this, it actually empowers. This is the irony of the situation. The very extra, ultra right, is always feeding from the extreme Islamists. The more they threaten the state of Israel, you're strengthening the hands of the right in Israel. This is the irony of the situation. You want to preempt it by opening the negotiations and sitting around the table and discussing it.
I want to thank everybody for attending, and we've got an excellent presentation coming up here momentarily. So for those of you who would stay, to your benefit, thank you very much.